Okay, I'm doing my presentation today on Q exposure therapy. Um, so I'm going to get into my case presentation. I have Jill, who's a 38-year-old Native American. She was born and raised on the Rocky Boy Reservation. Although she no longer lives there, she moved to Missoula about a year ago. Her family is still on the reservation. Um, Jill is co occurring disordered. She has substance use and PTSD. The PTSD stems from she's had a history of childhood sexual and adult sexual as well as physical abuse. Um, she's been living or using since the age of 10. Her parents have substance use disorders as well, so she's been exposed to domestic violence and alcohol and drug use from a very young age. She initially started using just alcohol and marijuana, although her disease has progressed and she's now an IV drug user. She's a polysubstance abuser, although she can name primary drugs of choice. Her primary drug of choice is methamphetamine, and then second would be prescription painkillers, and third would be alcohol. So she just tends to cross addict from one to the other. If she's unable to get a hold of the illegal substances, she always has the fallback of alcohol, and it's pretty easily to obtain. Jill is working or was working as a housekeeper at the Holiday Inn over there in Missoula. She does not have her GED. Um, because of the progression of her disease, she was unable to show up at work. She just was very inconsistent in being able to make it to work. And so she eventually lost her job. As a result of her losing her job, she lost her apartment because she couldn't afford rent. And so she's been living on the streets of Missoula for the past 2 months, or couch surfing at friend's house. Although she kind of likes to isolate, so she doesn't have a whole lot of friends that she can rely on. So she's pretty much on her own. Um, so Jill was living on the streets, and she was DTN off of alcohol, and so she was shaking pretty bad, and she needed to get a fix. And so it was before 8 in the morning, and as you know, you can't purchase alcohol prior to 8 o'clock in the morning. But she was hurting pretty bad, and so she decided that she needed to go to the convenience store and try to shoplift some alcohol to make herself well. So she went over to the convenience store and she grabbed a tall boy of Steel Reserve and was apprehended by the store clerk and told that she could not buy it prior to 8 a.m. So she put the beer back and started walking around the convenience store to kind of distract the clerks, and ends up back over in the beer aisle and grabs a Steel Reserve and shoves it under her coat and leaves the convenience store. Um, as she is outside in the parking lot, there were two clerks, they followed her outside to to stop her, and she responded with, "I can do whatever I want," and ended up punching one of the clerks in the face, and then ends up taking off on foot. So the clerks end up calling law enforcement, and law enforcement picks her up a couple blocks away from the convenience store. They charge her with burglary because she assaulted the clerk. So she was charged with burglary and brought in. When she was brought in, they searched her, and in her possession was a meth pipe that had some meth residue on it. are in it, and so she was charged with criminal possession of dangerous drugs. Um, she sat in Missoula County Detention Center for 6 months, and she arrived at Elkhorn Treatment Center in April of 2016. So I'm going to give you a little background of Elkhorn Treatment Center. Elkhorn is a 9-month treatment program, and it's mostly for, well, it is for those who've been convicted of substance abuse crimes. It used to be Elkhorn opened about 7 or 8 years ago, and initially it was open to combat the meth epidemic in Montana. And most of the participants at Elkhorn Treatment Center have a meth-related crime on their record, although some of them do not have meth on their record. Um, while while participants are at Elkhorn, they engage in 9 hours of CD group a week, and that includes a one-on-one session with a CD counselor. Um, their criminal thinking is addressed in SSIC and CPNR, which is strategies for structuring change and cognitive principles in restructuring. And basically, that's like CBT kind of classes. They change their thinking and their behavior and do thinking error reports and those type of things. They also have everybody there has to go through a parenting class, and their mental health, it's not addressed very much, but their mental health is addressed in, we have two mental health groups. We have a co-occurring group, a group that everybody has to take, and then an abuse group. So if you've had any history of abuse, physical or sexual, in your past, then you're put in abuse group. So Jill would be attending abuse and co-occurring and all the other groups that I mentioned. She's also placed in a GED class that we have at Elkhorn. So she's progressing quite well through her treatment. She came in at the pre-contemplation stage of change, and as she progressed through treatment, she's now at the preparation stage of change. And people generally hit the preparation stage of change around 6 weeks prior to their discharge. So during this time, people are placed in the relapse prevention group, and their treatment plans are centered around relapse prevention. During relapse prevention, we, address triggers and coping skills of the participants. So that brings me up to cue therapy. Cue therapy is something that you do in relapse prevention, although we don't do it at Elkhorn Treatment Center. Cue therapy addresses cravings that people have, and it's Pavlovian conditioning, where objects are kind of paired with addictive substances and elicit cravings. So various cues are presented, like prescription bottles, beer bottles, light bulbs, those types of things that would elicit cravings, and then therapists work with participants to kind of navigate through the cravings that they're having and kind of change their reactivity to these cravings. Cues can contribute to relapse, so that's why I think we'd address it in relapse prevention. There's limitations to cue therapy. Cue therapy is not an evidence-based practice, although it has been proven to be quite effective if it's used in conjunction with other EBPs like CBT and DBT. And it's not been consistent in reducing cravings, so I read numerous articles, and some of them raved about cue therapy, and others of them were like, well, it's not that great. And the ones that I read where it wasn't consistent in reducing cravings, those particular studies happened to do, or kind of centered around the fact that like we just bring in these random objects to kind of help people address their cravings. So you wouldn't necessarily take your client and ask them specifically what cues bothered them and then bring in those cues. You just would kind of bring in a plethora of items and help people work through that. So they found it to be more consistent if you actually talk to your client to figure out what was triggering to them and then bring those into the session. There's possible dilemmas with cue therapy. When I first started reading about this stuff, I thought, wow, that's kind of crazy. Being in recovery myself, it was I don't know, it was kind of cool, but a little bit overwhelming. Um, and then the more I thought about it, the more I thought, wow, we should really be doing that stuff because I can remember when I was going through treatment, inpatient treatment facilities, and they wouldn't let us listen to certain music because they found that that was too triggering to us. So they kind of censored even what we listened to. And kept thinking, that's crazy. Like, what better place to be triggered than in inpatient treatment facility where we have therapists around us to kind of help us navigate those cravings and those thoughts. So I do think that cue therapy could be very beneficial. Um, and then when you're uh, doing cue therapy, you want to make sure that you do it. What the therapist is well trained, not only in cue therapy, but in how to navigate those triggers and cravings. So, although I find it extremely interesting, I do not feel like I am very qualified at all right now to tackle something like this. And then here's some questions that came up as I was doing some of my research, and I talked a little bit about this. So you want to take, your client, individual client, and you want to ask them what objects elicit a craving to use and or drink to make the cue therapy sessions a little more tailored to their specified triggers. Um, and there's objects and places that elicit cravings. So I was reading an alcohol study where they used cue therapy and they used virtual reality. And so they'd take participants and they'd interview them and find out what sorts of settings triggered their cravings and what objects. And then they'd take their electronic devices and plug in bar scenes and, black velvet bottles or whatever they found triggering. And then they'd have the participants watch these virtual reality videos and then help them navigate and de escalate. So that is my presentation for the cue therapy. I'm going to upload another YouTube video with me and Laura doing the skills presentation. Thank you.